Looking back at the Cabinet papers of 1989, for me, has been the most interesting one that I've been involved in, because it was such a transformation period in Queensland's history. It's fascinating to look back as well to see how Cabinet operated 30 years ago. And 1989, of course, was an historic year globally. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was when the internet came to Australia. At that time, we saw the climax of the Fitzgerald inquiry. Queenslanders did not yet have a direct line to their ministers or politicians through internet and social media. And we're reminded of remarks that Kerry O'Brien made in relation to that. And he said, one of the biggest elements in the systemic failure of proper government scrutiny in those years in Queensland, that is, the scrutiny of government was a fundamental failure of the media in that regard. By the time he was well ensconced, Joe would laugh openly and often at the journalist he fed like chooks, at his leisure and with complete contempt. How things have changed. The Fitzgerald report was publicly released in July 1989, and the papers contain the submissions and the decisions. 8,500 copies went out the door, including 2 reprints in 7 days. Politically for Queensland, there's never been a year like 1989 before, and there's never been a year like 1989 since. The parliamentary record shows the Labor opposition relentlessly pursuing those governments in the House on its actions around the inquiry and the report. And we know that even before he had read the report, Premier Michael Hearn promised to implement the reforms with that famous remark, lock, stock and barrel. But there was such resentment from his Cabinet colleagues over that that would shortly come to the boil, as we'll hear shortly. And Commissioner Fitzgerald stated in his summary that the corruption in Queensland revealed by the inquiry was entrenched, that it was systematic, that it was indeed widespread. And a number of high-profile Cabinet figures were implicated in misconduct, as we know. Don Lane, Leisha Harvey, Brian Austin, Jeff Muntz, all either resigned or removed from the Conservative Cabinet during the year of 1989. And the year culminates, of course, in something that we've already celebrated this year. In December, Wayne Goss led Labor to a landslide victory over the Cooper government, ending 32 unbroken years of Conservative rule in Queensland. And I think we can all agree that Goss delivered a decent, stable government, the sort of decent, stable Labor government that continues today in Queensland. One of the striking features of this year's papers is something really quite simple, and I want to thank you, Jonathan, for pointing this out. And it's something that most of us probably would not have recognised in our analysis. It's the numbering of Cabinet papers. Cabinet submissions had always been numbered sequentially from one government to the next from the time that Cabinets existed. It was as if their rule would never end, and the papers will show you an exact total, right on the nose, of 58,000 submissions considered by Queensland Cabinets. And upon the election of the Goss government and its first Cabinet meeting, and you'll see papers from 2 of its Cabinet meetings in 1989, submissions went back to start at number 1. And most of us probably wouldn't have noticed that. So again, Jonathan, thank you for pointing it out. And I think what it does, it reflects the commencement of a new era in Queensland, a new birth of democracy and decency in governing. And at that first Cabinet meeting on 11th of December 1989, the Premier Goss submitted the first ever Queensland Cabinet Handbook and the new financial guidelines. And so it is Cabinet submission number 00001 that you'll see there on the table. And Goss, so determined to begin a new era in Queensland politics, commenced that numbering from 1, and Dr Richards will go into that in more detail shortly. And Tony Fitzgerald is, in his report, is saying, after he became Premier, Wayne's leadership produced the reforms which transformed this state. In the end, I think the papers and history shows us that the nail in the coffin of the 1989 National Party government was the rolling of Premier Michael Hearn for Russell Cooper. The Cabinet papers show Ahern's commitment to implementing the recommendations lock, stock and barrel, but that was seriously disrupted the Nationals' status quo and normal approach to the business of government. Fitzgerald had commented on the going-ons of Cabinet in his report, saying that Cabinet had become so consumed with the detail of administration and triviality. While they were buried in the triviality of their agenda in Cabinet, they would make up to 80 decisions a meeting under Cooper. And what the papers don't show was any consideration from the National Party that they ever contemplated the possibility of ever losing government. Quite extraordinary. I want to conclude and hand over to the main show, to Jonathan. What these Cabinet minutes show, I think, is that an overhaul of the processes of government, of course, was long overdue. I think it's fair to describe 1989 as one of possibly the 2 or 3 most pivotal years in Queensland political history. The papers set the tone politically, socially and economically for the next 3 decades. And now that democracy through institutions like the Queensland State Archives is digitised, the internet and social media have amplified our community's drive for integrity and accountability, and I think rightly so. So I want to acknowledge the role that the Queensland State Archives, its staff and its volunteers play as the stewards of our state's history. And the Queensland State Archive is heralded as the best archive, not just in Australia, but the best archive in the world. And I think that means Queenslanders have the best ability to scrutinise their past of any citizens in the world. And I think that means that Queenslanders have the brightest future of any citizens anywhere in the world. And if you noticed on the way in, as all public buildings do, there's a plaque on the wall commemorating the opening of the Queensland State Archives. And you won't be surprised to recall or notice on your way out that it was Wayne Goss that built and opened this facility, the best in the world, in 1993.
As the Minister said, it was a really big year, especially internationally for things like the Berlin Wall. We saw the emergence of the internet. The first GPS satellite was put in orbit. How many of you got here today using that technology? After having lived through the Bjelke-Petersen years, I never ever thought we would see a change of government. In the Cabinet minutes, there are numerous references to decisions that they will make after the election. They were so confident that they were going to win that they were already planning for 1990. So that really does suggest this was a government that was quite out of touch with its own voting base as well as everything else. The media, of course, played a huge role, and I think we should acknowledge the role of the media in making that change of government happen, particularly, of course, the ABC. This is the only year that I've reported on where there were 3 premiers. There were 3 cabinets and there were 2 governments. I don't believe that had ever happened before. I doubt that it'll ever happen again. So I think, as the Minister said, 1989 is one of the 3 most important years in Queensland history. The first is 1859, when we separated from New South Wales and became a separate colony. The second is 1915, when the Labor Party was first elected to form government in Queensland. And what a huge change that was too. So I think 1989 is up there. It's one of the 3 most crucial years in Queensland history. Of course, the Fitzgerald inquiry is got to be the focus of the year. And again, if you're under 40, you probably missed it. You don't realise what a landmark event that was. The release of the Fitzgerald report took place at the exhibition, and the media just swarmed over the place. I really don't think the National Party realised the can of worms that they opened when they agreed to hold the Fitzgerald inquiry. I think that Bill Gunn suspected it would be over in 3 weeks, 6 weeks. Might find a few casinos, bit of gambling, bit of prostitution. They had no idea it would run for hundreds of days and result in the Commissioner of Police going to prison, as well as many others. I think we're still reaping the benefits of the Fitzgerald inquiry today. We don't always live in a perfect state, but we live in a much better state than we did in 1988.
Jonathan's work highlights that the Ahern Cabinet refused a submission recommending additional funding for health services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and instead funded opposition to the Mabo application. In 1989, Queensland versus Mabo and others was discussed at Cabinet and $232,000, which was a pretty big sum in those days, was approved for the Mabo case. Listening to your observations, Jonathan, and your analysis of the papers, it's pretty hard to believe that was only 30 years ago in many of our lifetimes.
Cabinet had already made a decision in previous years that health facilities were to be transferred from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs to the Department of Health. In other words, Indigenous communities were to be treated the same as every other Queenslander. But when it came to providing funding, Cabinet refused. They just said, no, we are not going to provide money. That also included policing as well, because there was a transfer of watch houses, police watch houses, from the Department of Police to corrective services. And again, it was Indigenous communities that missed out. They just said, no, there's no money. So it's quite clear. There are some really quite racist comments in the submissions, and you could only conclude that there are some quite racist decisions as well. Mabo being, of course, the tip of the iceberg. The other big story in 1989, and I think it really illustrates the tension in the National Party and the electorate, is daylight saving. And we had a trial, and ministers were quite convinced. They said, well, it might be popular in Brisbane, but nobody out in the bush wants it, so therefore we've got to get rid of it. Not stopping to think that the numbers of people were hugely out of whack. So I think that's a really interesting example. I think Ahern thought, well, we can try daylight saving and see if it works. And the National Party said no, the television will be out of sequence and skin cancer rates will go up, and they didn't mention curtains.
The first Cabinet meeting when Goss was elected, is there anything in particular that stands out for you in that very first meeting?
Yes, order. It goes from chaos to complete order. National Party Cabinet meetings must have been a circus. I have seen references to them shouting at each other. I have heard it called a three-ring circus. We were discussing before how different ministers managed to get their submissions higher up the order of business. Because by the end of the day, or the end of the meeting, you can tell that they're tired. But the Goss Cabinet, the first meeting just talks about what does a Cabinet do. So one of the things they discuss is a Cabinet handbook. The National Party had never even had that kind of conversation, not in all the years I've ever looked at. Cabinet was just a free-for-all. All of a sudden, Cabinet is serious. It is doing the business of government, the machinery of government. So Goss lays out half a dozen rules that are just so clear and such common sense, you think, why on earth had nobody done this before? Cabinet will only deal with things that are important. It will not be wasting time. It will not be hearing last-minute oral submissions as the National Party had been. And there's some corkers in the oral submissions from the National Party. So I had the privilege of meeting Wayne Goss here in the search room once. And I get quite emotional talking about him, and I was quite honoured to meet him and just to say thank you. It's quite sad that he's no longer with us to enjoy this day. He would have loved it. Reading through the media coverage, but most importantly the parliamentary debates, he was a man without equal in his time. He really was a leader, and I think we are all in his debt. And like I say, I was just so honoured to have met him and just say thank you.